Hello everyone, this is Falcon202 from Modern Gamer TV. As promised, the final missing link from the complete chronological story explanation for Metal Gear is here. In this video we'll be covering Metal Gear Solid 5. Now, before beginning with the story explanation, there are a few housekeeping things and points I would like to raise from the beginning. The first is that really the best way to absorb the Metal Gear Solid 5 story is through the cassette tapes. It's best to check them out first. It's best to actually use them over this video because they are superbly voice acted and they're presented well. It's in the context of a story, a scene, and so I think the best experience of the Metal Gear Solid 5 story will be the cassette tapes, and you really don't need this. So that leads to the next question of, well, why am I making a story explanation for MGS5? And that is merely to complete the chronological video that I made back a while ago. It's the first video I made, and to date it is coming up to 16,000 views. It has been received really well. I would like to thank everyone for the friendly comments. It really builds up my motivation to do more videos. The other point I'd like to make is that we'll be going past inconsequential stuff. We'll be skipping them. So some things will be missed, but please ask if anything is not clear about the story. And also there'll be more videos on Metal Gear coming up after this one. There'll be analysis videos, critiques, etc, etc. But I wanted to make the story explanations first, and so we can get them out the way. So moving on with Metal Gear Solid 5. So Metal Gear Solid 5 will be right after Ground Zeroes. So after the medics stabilize Big Boss following the events of Ground Zeroes, Eva arranges for Big Boss to be transported to the British sovereign base Dekelia, which is situated in Cyprus. You won't know it's Eva unless you listen to the final set of truth tapes. We will touch more upon why, how, and the actual reasons behind him being there later in due course. Just accept that this was his location, and that until the ending, Phantom Big Boss genuinely thought he was placed there to hide from Zero, as it is the last place he would be expected to look. But there is obviously far more to it than that, as can be seen from Eva's and Ocelot's involvement, but more on that when we get to the end. When playing or seeing the prologue, the player or observer will notice a few odd things. Why does Ishmael sound like Keith Sutherland? Or Naked Snake?
What happened to the woman?
The woman? We gave her a light. She took the short way down.
Who are you?
Who am I? You're talking to yourself.
Why has Naked Snake got metal debris sticking out of his head and a bionic arm when this was not the case in Metal Gear 2? We also see him again in Metal Gear 2 and Metal Gear Solid 4, seeming normal and intact, different to what he appears to look like in Metal Gear Solid 5. We will come back to those questions later. It has something to do with Hideo Kojima's postmodernistic storytelling. Note you are right in questioning them, and the reason for this is because of a plot twist at the end. So moving on. After 9 years, Big Boss wakes up and is told that he has 108 foreign bodies embedded with fragments of human bone and teeth. Most of them were removed, but some fragments had to remain, which explains the giant horn you see. By the way, the horn could not be removed, as that would cause a hemorrhage. He is then told that 9 years has passed since he fell into a coma. His identity will also need to be changed to keep him safe from harm. The player is given a character creation screen where the player has to input their date of birth and make a character. Again, this is done on purpose as it directly relates to the plot and an Easter egg, but back on that later. At this point, it's important to note that the debris sticking out of his head means that he can't take knocks to the head without getting stunned, and you may notice that in the game when you do take knocks to the head, and that he may hallucinate. The hallucinations will explain certain events and characters Snake sees that aren't actually there, but we'll get on that later. A while later, we notice that something seems odd as a mysterious female soldier arrives attempting to assassinate everyone in the room, her actual target being Big Boss. It is at this moment that Ishmael comes to Snake's rescue in an attempt to fend off the XOF operative. The encounter results in the female assassin, who we later know as Quiet, jumping out of a window after being set on fire and burned pretty badly. The assassin is an XOF operative. For now, just note that XOF is an anti-terror unit made in conjunction with Fox back in Metal Gear Solid 3, or the Virtuous mission. They were a secret group that no one knew about until Ground Zeroes. For now, just accept that Quiet's whole body is burned and that she comes back further on in the plot. I'll explain how she survived the encounter later. as there is a separate backstory to that. Yeah, that's all you need to know about XWF for now. We'll go in detail about when they were made, because they were made back in Metal Gear Solid 3 when the Virtuous mission was happening. And if you don't remember where that is, the video does explain it, but if you don't remember where that was, it was at the time where it was the mission in which Naked Snake gets thrown off the bridge. After dealing with the XOF assassin, the pair move out and notice that the XOF military group is eradicating everyone they see in the hospital. During their escape, the pair stumble into what appears to be a floating child with psychokinetic powers and a man on fire, which is literally what the game and we will refer to from now on. We will also get back to these two characters later, explaining their backstory and how they have managed to acquire their abilities. Moving on, it appears that water temporarily disables the man on fire, and that the child is enabling or animating it. We'll explain how later. After some pretty close encounters, the pair escapes the hospital and flee from the man on fire, boarding onto an ambulance vehicle, which ends up being slammed off-road with the pair getting knocked out. After Snake wakes up, he notices Ishmael is gone. Ocelot then comes and rescues Naked Snake, with a final chase happening between Man on Fire, Ocelot, and Snake on horseback. Man on Fire stops pursuing when the two get to the river. After successfully fleeing, the two head to Afghanistan boarding a big tanker. They change ships at Suez Canal onto a cargo ship to avoid detection while en route to Pakistan. They would pass through Peshawar in Pakistan to get to Afghanistan, with the rest of the trip being on horseback as the roads are under Soviet control and too risky. Once they get to Afghanistan, Snake proceeds to rescue Miller, who was imprisoned by the Soviets while he was training the local guerrillas. After rescuing him, and on his way back, he is ambushed by the Skulls unit. At this point in time in the story, little is known about them, but we'll explain how they have the abilities they possess as it relates to a bioweapon made by reverse evolution, etc. Snake evades them and returns to Mother Base. At this point, we get a little bit of a snapshot of the global scene since Big Boss's coma. In the cassette tape titled World in Over 9 Years, Ocelot talks about the emergence of PFs, short for private forces. He informs that the mercenary business model Snake and Miller pioneered made a golden opportunity for PFs to step in where countries did not want to risk their own army men when responding to groups like Islamic extremists, etc. This is the important bit to note, as it shows the gradual shift to a war economy, which is the biggest issue in Metal Gear Solid 4. But Metal Gear Solid 5's ending would explain how it really got the ball rolling with the Patriots AI. But more on that later. It makes sense to talk about that near the end. Just know at this point in time that there were many PFs emerging. These are mainly the private forces you are faced with on missions in free roam, particularly in Africa. For example, in Africa you have three major private forces. You have Contract Forces of Africa, short for CFA for short. You have Rogue Coyote, and Zero Risk Security. So moving on. The first set of missions take place in Afghanistan, most of which are not that key to the story, so I'll just focus on what you need to know for the first 9 missions. At this point in time, we are aware that the Soviet occupation in Afghanistan is being countered by the Afghan militia called the Mujahideen. The US would support the militia via Pakistan and by supplying military tech to the Mujahids. The Afghan militia is complicated, as it consists of a number of different Afghan tribes. You have the Hazaras, who are ancestrally Mongolian, Pashtuns, and Tajiks. They are not that important to know, but it just talks a little bit about the tribal side of things in Afghanistan. But we need to be mindful of an operation that the Soviets were doing, and that was called the Scorched Earth Operation. This will seem irrelevant to many players, but it is key, as I will explain later, that this was actually a cleanup operation for a bioweapon test we'll talk about later. By the way, the bioweapon is a big part of the story of this installment, but more on that later. Just note that the Scorched Earth operation was not just a blind act of revenge on its own, as you were led to believe in the beginning bits. So the Afghans are fending off the Russians pretty well, except for their gunships, which they are ill-equipped for. Hence why the United States supplied them with the Honeybee, which is a state-of-the-art homing missile launcher, which not even anti-tracking or anti-homing measures can prevent. However, it was believed that the Russians ended up killing the Hamid fighters that were in possession of it in Dismasay Laman. but they most likely died due to the bioweapon which was being tested in that region. Hence why you were contracted by the West to get the honeybee back before the Soviets do. But not only do you return it back, you also end up reverse engineering it for yourself, you cheeky fuck. The first few missions involve you taking out key leaders in the Scorched Earth operation, which is why you are going around taking out commanders and key players in that operation. During the first set of missions, you are also tasked to rescue a bionics expert who will enable you to upgrade your arm in different ways, but I will say no more on that as that is not important. We'll only focus on the key story bits and flesh them out with as much detail as possible, so we won't be going through the generic or inconsequential stuff, as I said at the beginning. We'll touch more upon Operation Scorched Earth later. Just know that there is more to it than simply the burning of villages, farms, and huge acres of land. Similarly, a related cleanup happens in Africa, but let's not get too far ahead of ourselves at this point. So after getting the honeybee, Snake encounters the Skulls again and defeats them. He also has a brief encounter with Skullface and co, but the dialogue here is inconsequential. So after defeating the Skulls, Snake returns to Mother Base. Upon returning, Big Boss gets more information in the form of a tape about past dealings between Kaz and Cypher. If you are confused at this point, then that is because in Peace Walker, Kaz admits to secretly carrying out dealings with Zero regarding MSF prior to the events of Metal Gear Solid 5, Ground Zeroes, and Peace Walker. He explains that Zero's plan was to coax Snake and Miller into Central America to fuel Mother Base's growth. Once they were big enough, Cypher would coerce MSF to join them as they had no proper army, just a powerful information and intelligence network. Hence why Paz was sent in by Cypher to try and coerce them to join, threatening to fire a nuke from Ziki, which would cause the world to unite against them. If you remember from the other video, where she was giving Snake an ultimatum to join Cypher or, risk the launch, but then she ended up getting thrown into the ocean, if you remember. Well, you should remember, because this video is the set part 2 to that video. Anyways, Kaz is confused as to why Cypher is still after Snake, despite Mother Base being destroyed following the sham inspection. The game was already hinting that perhaps it was not Zero all along behind the recent events. The tape is mainly to update the players on what happened before Metal Gear 5, but it also sheds light on Miller's confusion, who already notices that it is out of character and odd for Zero. This is no accident, it relates to the ending, so take note of it. It is also worthwhile talking a little bit about the new Mother Base. If you remember, the previous Mother Base was destroyed by XOF in Ground Zeroes. A new Mother Base was made in Seychelles, which is in the Indian Ocean. Kaz explains that this is a prime location for mercenary organizations, as it's near many conflict zones, like Africa, Lebanon, and the Middle East. That is all we need to know for now regarding Mother Base. So progressing on, you get information from Ocelot about tales of a legendary sniper that is lurking and taking out key people in the Soviet militia, leaving no trace behind. Well, just corpses. You encounter her in Mission 10, which is what we will talk about next. Fast forward to Mission 10, you encounter Quiet, whom, surprise surprise, is still alive, but has more powers and abilities than when you first see her back in the hospital, the woman that tried to assassinate you. After defeating her, the player has a choice to either kill her there and then or to have her come on board Mother Base and be present furthermore in the story. We will assume that you take her on Mother Base. We'll get back to Quiet in a bit, as the reason to why she is still alive relates to something very important in the game, and it makes sense to talk more about some of the characters' backstory and villains' special abilities when dealing with the bioweapon. When the pair of you get back to Mother Base, Quiet voluntarily stays on board in a cell that she can easily escape out of. In the tapes, Ocelot reports that he purposely let the security in her cell be weak to see if she would actually attempt any assassinations, revealing what her motives are. It was an attempt to see why she really is voluntarily here when she can just freely break out. Much to their surprise, she doesn't actually attempt to do anything. The characters are not sure what her motives are at the time, but the final mission involving Quiet reveals all. More on that later, that's nearly towards the end. In the interim, you can buddy up and journey with her on your operations. The idea behind allowing her to come with you comes from Ocelot, as he thinks that if she does intend on killing Big Boss at Mother Base, she will most likely do so out in the open away from Mother Base. Risky idea, but it's clever. She does not attempt to take up Big Boss during your ops, safe to say, so you can relax. Ocelot predicts and suggests that she was indeed sent out to kill Snake, but something has changed, primarily because she has not made any attempts to contact anyone outside the base, nor has she tried anything yet. like assassination or breakout attempts. She just remains quiet in her cell. All that Ocelot has observed since she comes on the base is two things. One, she does not breathe through her lungs. Two, she gets nutrients from photosynthesis, much like plants, hence why she has little clothing. But this seems doubtful as the only reason, as many players have pretty much said a whole array of things about her revealing clothing, but that's a topic for a separate video. So the next key story mission is number 12, called Hellbound. This is the mission where you finally get informed that Hal Emmerich wants to defect. The boss and the staff at Mother Base have huge desires to use this opportunity to exact revenge on him, as they believe he was the main reason as to why Mother Base was destroyed by XOF in Ground Zeroes. If you do not remember, you should, but nonetheless I'll give you a little snapshot. A UN inspection was requested in which Emmerich agreed so that they could quash any suspicions regarding their nuclear weapons, which they would obviously hide from plain sight. Emmerich even went as far as to have the guards on Mother Base stripped of their weapons to avoid any feelings of hostility for their guests. Seeing how the guards were defenseless, they were slaughtered at the sham inspection and made short work of. Snake proceeds to make contact with Emmerich in the facility in which Sahelanthropus is stationed. Skullface is informed that Emmerich has sent coded messages to Snake, revealing his plans on defecting. Skullface confronts him about this and throws him down some stairs, and takes him back to his lab, and imprisons him as he is still needed to work on Sahelanthropus. It is here where Snake breaks him out of the lab, and upon doing so, he notices the AI pod is still there from Peace Walker, but it jets out the labs, rocketing to Mother Base. But before doing so, the game hints at the plot twist already, right before your eyes. The big boss AI in Mammal Pod does not recognize Phantom Snake.
Snake? It's not you, is it?
Hey!
So could he actually be Big Boss? Well, I'm assuming that you've already played the game, so you know the answer to that question. In the previous video, I did not explain much about the AI pods, and I'll take this opportunity to do so now. So let's talk a little bit about the AI pods in the game, in the franchise. So if we quickly draw your attention back to Peace Walker, you see multiple machines having reptile pods, which control the autonomous behavior and posture control for the machines. But Peace Walker had a second pod called the Mammal Pod, which was designed by Dr. Strangelove. The purpose of the second pod was to implant the will and personality of the boss. However, during the chilling encounter between Peace Walker and Snake, Snake pulls out the memory boards. That is when its functions were transferred to its reptile pod. If you remember in the scene, there were talks about a functional compensation, where the reptile pod would compensate for what was lost in the mammal pod. Anyways, it was that pod that was sitting in Emmerich's lab. Dr. Strangelove got it salvaged at the bottom of Lake Nicaragua, with the help from her friend Amanda. So that was the same mammal pod that you see back from Peace Walker. So moving on. So Big Boss rescues Huey. While trying to evac him, Skullface and co. show up with Sahelanthropus, which is confusingly mobile despite it not having a completed functional and posture control AI system. This is something that Emmerich notes before being pushed down the stairs and in his cassette tapes, which you can listen to. Emmerich is dumbfounded as to how it is operational, as his alternative method to get it moving was not complete yet. If you remember back in the scene, just before he got pushed down the stairs, he was battering on about the AI control not being complete yet. But moving on. You fight Sahelanthropus and obviously you defeat it. Otherwise that would be a very short game. After the fight, it goes back to Mother Base. Emmerich is being tortured and interrogated. He persistently pleads his innocence and says he had no idea the inspection was a sham back in Ground Zeroes. Phantom Boss decides that until further proof is obtained, that judgment should not be given yet. As you progress in the story, we see further torture sequences and more information coming out of Emmerich in the form of cassette tapes, but we'll talk about his fate towards the end. I would also like to talk a little bit about what else was found in the mammal pod. It seems an appropriate time to talk about that now. We find that there was a corpse in the mammal pod and that it was Dr. Strangelove's body after they managed to ID it. So after frequent arguments regarding AI control for the new Metal Gear between Strangelove and Skullface, we were led to believe by Emmerich that she committed suicide by jumping into the pod, but later on we hear that she was actually thrown in there by Emmerich himself in the final audio recording of the AI pod. We also find that there was a scar on her lower abdomen. Emmerich mentions that they had a baby, which they named Hal. Yes, that is Hal Otacon Emmerich. But the child was given away by Strangelove after Emmerich wanted to use Hal as a test subject. Rest assured, we do see Hal being Solid Snake's best friend and a main character in the game later on in the timeline. As said before, we find out more truths about Emmerich's dishonest character and shadiness later on in the game towards the ending, so we will get back to the rest of the details there. As Big Boss is leaving, Ocelot catches up, mentioning that Emmerich has just told him that new research is happening in Africa and the funding has been pulled from the research taking place in Afghanistan. All Emmerich knows is that a weapon that will surpass Metal Gear is being researched in Africa. And that is the iconic scene in which Big Boss says it's not just another nuke. So at this point in time in the game, you now have Africa as a playable map, and you also have the addition of other missions that you can go down. So if you fast forward into mission 13, here you are tasked by an environmental NGO to stop an oil spill from continuing by destroying the oil field facility occupied by Uniter, who are contracted by what appears to be Cypher. After carrying out the objective, we see corpses emerge with cyst-like growths on their chests. We are starting to see the effects of the bioweapon, and you don't know at the point. Well, you won't know this when you're actually playing the mission, but after a while, you realize that the whole purpose of the oil spill was another cleanup operation, like Scorched Earth. You know, the one that we talked about earlier. But once we talk about the bioweapons, we'll explain more about the oil field, what happened at the oil field, and the Scorched Earth operation. Fast forward to mission 20. One of the 6 children you rescue from an earlier mission contracts you to save their leader, called Shabani, using the last of their diamonds. He was taken to Nagumba Industrial Zone, which is tightly guarded by a PF. Nearby residents rumour that the devil lies there and that they are scared of the place, primarily because of the atrocities that take place there. The hope is that Shabani will be able to leak some information about Cypher to Diamond Dogs after they rescue him. Upon arriving there, things seem really off and eerie. In fact, if you look carefully in one of the tents, you can see an Easter egg referencing PT Silent Hills.
When his 10-year-old son came to investigate the commotion, the father shot him too. His 6-year-old daughter had the good sense to hide in the bathroom, but reports suggest he lured her out by telling her it was just a game. The girl was found shot once in the chest from point-blank range. The mother, who he shot in the stomach, was pregnant at the time. Police arriving on scene after neighbors called 911 found the father in his car, listening to the radio. Several days before the murders, neighbors say they heard the father repeating a sequence of numbers in a loud voice. They said it was like he was chanting some strange spell. There was another family shot to death in the same state last month, and in December last year, a man used a rifle and meat cleaver to murder his entire family. In each case, the perpetrators were fathers. State police say this string of domestic homicides appears unrelated, though it could be part of a larger trend such as employment, child care, and other social issues facing the average family. As the congressional debate over gun control flares up yet again, we regret to report the murder of a wife and her 2 children by their husband and father.
Which is quite cool. You enter a building which has bad news written all over it. The setting is grimy and dark, and there are pools of blood everywhere. You go in to find people strapped down to their beds with cyst-like growths on their chests, like the corpses you see at the Mfinda oil field. You see their throats cut open with an acoustic tube placed inside that is hooked to pre-recorded stuff. When the Mother Base Intel team analyzes your radio transmissions, you are told that it is a compilation of different news and languages apart from English, which is ironic because it is the world's dominant lingua franca. The Intel team picked up other languages, though, such as Russian, Hindi, Arabic, Cantonese, German, but no English. Big Boss proceeds further and finds Shabani barely alive. He takes his necklace from him, but immediately hides from Skullface, who arrives at the scene. Skullface notices Big Boss and he subsequently attacks him using the man on fire and the psychokinetic child. As you get into a bit of a tussle, the Devil's house burns down and Big Boss fights the man on fire outside, but it's not really a fight, as Big Boss is just trying to buy enough time for a timely evac on the chopper. The player is to submerge or soak the man on fire, which incapacitates him, and by doing so it gives you a small time window for you to escape on the chopper. After you escape, Big Boss returns without Shabani and instead gives the disappointed children his necklace. Now will be a good time to introduce the man on fire and the floating boy, but we'll explain their abilities and backstory fully later. Starting with the man on fire. The man on fire is Volgan, who is the main villain and crew commander from Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater. If you remember, Big Boss destroys the Shargahad, and by doing so, Volgan gets burnt pretty severely. His body would be taken to a research facility in the outskirts of Moscow. The medics could not explain how he managed to survive the burns and the damage that he went through, as they were pretty severe. However, it appears that he is animated via the third boy, or the floating boy, which we will introduce now, but will explain the full extent of his abilities later on. So let's introduce the floating boy. If the clue did not make it clear, then this will help. A cassette titled Man on Fire 3 sheds light on this. On the day that the research facility Man on Fire was then burnt down, a Soviet jumbo passenger jet also crashed nearby, plummeting 8,000 feet. On board was a young boy who was also being studied at the facility. The boy's body was not recovered from the wreckage, thus implying that maybe he didn't die at the crash. Volgan woke up at roughly the same time the jumbo jet crashed, so at this point the game is hinting at some sort of interdependency, which we'll touch upon later. The boy is also known to protect his mind from other people's thoughts by insulating himself wearing a gas mask. The documentation at the research facility suggests that the boy has psychokinetic powers. Anything more on the man on fire and the boy will be explained later on in the video. That was just a short introduction. Oh, and by the way, the floating boy is Psycho Mantis from Metal Gear Solid 1. So after that, we'll fast forward to mission 23, called White Mamba. Contract forces of Africa soldiers at Bola Yamasa were wiped out. The adults inexplicably disappear, but later on we find out that it was actually because of the bioweapon. It doesn't affect prepubescent children, so that's why the children the children remain and are still there. The children are marauding and raiding nearby villages. The government contracts Diamond Dogs to locate the militia and kill them, but Miller wants you to reintegrate and rehabilitate them at Diamond Dogs. Your objectives here are to capture the White Mamba, who was actually Liquid Snake as a child, and his real name being Eli. When you get to him, there are numerous references to the Lord of the Flies, but that is a topic for another video. After fighting Liquid and defeating him, you subdue him and extract him back to Mother Base. It is worthwhile talking a little bit about the White Mamba now. It is quite clear that his amazing combat abilities come from the fact that he is a product of the Leon von Terrible's project, which I explained in the previous video. We know that he is the recessive genetic clone out of the two. He hates being called his actual name Eli, and he rejects his fate as being a clone soldier destined to fight and age quickly. He rebels against the purpose that was attributed to him by his makers, which is why he has such a hatred for his father as well. He has a burning desire for revenge and strong feelings of malice, which makes him doubly powerful, as we will explain later on. However, we need to deal with the confusion that is caused by a tape called White Mamba 3. In that tape, Ocelot gets the DNA results back and informs Big Boss that Eli is not his clone, as the DNA does not match. However, do not be fooled. That is still Liquid, and the DNA does not match because of the plot twist. The relationship between the two is pretty bad, and a good portion of your interaction with him involves you beating him down, and Eli failing to reintegrate on Mother Base. He's a right pain in the ass. Further on in the story, you start to see the bioweapon cause havoc on Mother Base. An infection has spread among Mother Base, slowly killing your staff. Quarantine and countermeasures are put in place while a solution is found. Ocelot informs you that an informant of yours knows the origins of the disease, and so you go to extract him in Mission 27 from his PF captors to get more information about this. Once you extract the informant back, you are informed that someone by the name of Code Talker will know what you need to know about the infection, and perhaps how to deal with it. You deploy to Lufter Valley to get to a mansion deep in the valley. After evading the Skull group guarding the route to the mansion and sneaking through to the basement, you finally meet Code Talker. Once you get to Code Talker, Big Boss shows him photos of some of the infected Diamond Dogs personnel. Code Talker confirms that he recognizes it and urges Big Boss to remain quiet, as he too may be infected by the bioweapon. He proceeds to tell Big Boss that the vocal cord parasites have infected the staff. He explains that what was visible in the pictures just shown to him are its larvae. The larvae enter the throat and attach themselves to the vocal cords, mimicking the host's membranes. Upon maturity, they mate after a sustained exposure to a sound. The larvae then feast on the host's lungs, killing it gradually. It only triggers on particular words or when a certain language is being spoken. And he also notes that there are language-specific strains. However, Code Talker cannot identify what language strain is on Mother Base because he's only been shown photos, but he explains that silence is the best method at preventing them from laying their children or copulating. Big Boss asks if there is a cure. Code Talker explains that once symptoms show, larvae have started to feast on the lungs already, and nothing can be done beyond that point. However, he does reveal a way of preventing infection. Big Boss carries him back to the chopper, and they both head towards Mother Base. During the chopper ride, Code Talker shows how to prevent or fight the infection. He shows a little vial that contains a microbe which turns the male parasites into females, preventing reproduction. The microbe results in one parasite infecting the other, meaning it prevents the parasites from killing you. The idea behind this is that the microbe in one parasite will begin to infect all the other parasites, preventing the copulation. The downside is that it alters the hosts as well, rendering them infertile. En route to Mother Base, a mist is formed ahead of you. You guessed it, you get ambushed by the Skulls unit, who sends your chopper down into the airfield, forcing you to fight them. After a tough battle, you survive and proceed with the evac, going into another cutscene. Here is where a lengthy discussion takes place around metallic archaea and Skullface's plan of global nuclear saturation. Now would be a good time to talk about both. Just note that nuclear saturation is one of a few goals of Skullface. It's part of his overall plan. So let's explain metallic archaea. If you remember back in mission number 29, early on in the game you are tasked to capture a truck that is being escorted by a convoy to Kaziba camp. Upon getting near the truck, a cutscene is triggered where you fight the Skulls unit again. After beating them, the Mother Base intel team provide a report on the cargo being transported by Cypher. The team notes that the cargo contained yellow cake and malachite. The team finds something peculiar about the yellow cake. They note that there is enriched uranium at the center of it, which is somewhat odd. Code Talker explains why the yellow cake in the cargo is special. After the chopper ride back to Mother Base, Code Talker gives more information on a metallic archaea in the form of tapes. So, what is metallic archaea? Metallic archaea is an extremophile. An extremophile is a microorganism, especially an archaean, that lives in conditions of extreme temperature, acidity, alkalinity, or chemical concentration. The metallic archaea is able to subsist on metal rather than organic matter, some of which consume uranium-235 in particular. As a result, they produce weapons-grade enriched uranium. A variation of metallic archaea is corrosive archaea, which is oxidized metals feeding off the energy in surrounding electrons. It is what took down your chopper and any vehicles you use against the Skulls in the encounter. You'll also happen to note that their blades are infused with that as well, which is why when you counter the Skulls with using R2, you can stab through the metal during the boss fight with their own sword. The metallic archaea is also key to one of Skullface's plans, global nuclear saturation. The idea is that Skullface would provide and saturate the world with nukes. However, he would secretly include a failsafe which can shut down the nukes at Skullface's will remotely. This would enable a guarantee that the weapons he would sell would not be used back on him. How? Well, the nuke's detonators would have a black box design. Any attempt to dismantle it would result in it being melted by corrosive archaea. After detonation has started, the nuke communicates to a surveillance satellite, which enables Skullface to review how it will be used. If the locks are not disengaged, or the nuke is not fired after detonation being triggered, the black box detonator will melt with corrosive archaea. The genius behind this idea is that the client will only ever know unless a detonation is initiated. He made sure he sold it to technologically primitive groups, as superpower nations are more likely to suss this out quickly. So what was the purpose of the cargo you got from the skulls? Uranium enriching archaea that was being sold to people. It was basically the means to which one can get enriching archaea. The malachite will catalyze the enriching process. The yellow cake had the organism in it already, which is why you see enriched uranium in the center, because there's already a small amount of the organism inside, and then when you add malachite to it, it speeds it up. It's kind of like the starter kit. So given all that, what was Code Talker's motives for researching metallic archaea? During the Cold War nuclear arms race, demand for uranium was obviously high, because it's a key ingredient for nukes. The ground beneath the Navajo had lots of it. The local workers were sent to go without protective gear to collect the radioactive materials, without being told about the radiation itself. When it would rain, traces of uranium would seep out and get blown away, contaminating land and water. Many of the workers became sick and died. Code Talker felt a moral obligation to work on the metallic archaea in hopes it would get rid of the uranium, but the project was not successful as the research costs were astronomically high. He goes on to say that Skullface then came into the picture, offering to continue the research, but his real purpose for picking it up was to focus on nuclear weapons, tricking Code Talker into continuing the research out of his dime. He held the Denir workers as hostages to ensure that Code Talker would continue his research, and so he does. After getting back to Mother Base and observing the parasite infection, Code Talker explains what it is. He explained that it is indeed the vocal cord parasite infection, and it is the Kokongo strain, to be precise. Symptoms will trigger when pronunciation specific to Kokongo occurs. He also explains that the patients you see in the Devil's House was being used as vectors to teach the parasites other major languages. He hands Diamond Dogs the Wolbachia vial so that the parasites cannot copulate anymore and they can go ahead and produce a vaccine. He also answers additional questions that Kaz and Ocelot have about the parasites. One of them being, how do they transmit, or how is the parasite transmitted? He says that they lay their eggs in the larynx. Most go into the lungs, but some mix in the saliva and is transmitted by droplets through coughing and sneezing. The symptoms are like a cold, he says. So they're transmitted when people cough and sneeze, much like how colds are spread. The Wolbachia has been prepared for vaccination, and the staff have been inoculated. The other question that Ocelot and Kaz ask is, how did this happen in the first place? Ocelot tries to find out how the infection started. A cipher theory is ruled out, as it is the Kokongo strain. It would not make sense to place that strain on Mother Base. They eventually learn that the 6 children you rescued earlier may have spread the infection. The parasites do not infect prepubescent people, but they can be carriers for others to infect. Code Talker also explains some of the tests that will be conducted with the parasites. He explains that Bwala was used as testing grounds to record the transmission speeds of the parasites by cipher, which is why CFA vanished and the children moved in. The test would be used to record. The tests that he would talk about were mainly set up to record transmission speeds and to monitor the effectiveness of the transmission to surrounding settlements, logging data as they go. The test site was also densely populated as well, proving to be a good area to do the test. After the tests, they would burn down the grounds to avoid the weapon being detected around the world, but due to a miscalculation, transmission speeds were faster than anticipated, and it got out of hand. That would result in the infection spreading further. When it came to burn the village, the river swelled and many of the bodies became waterlogged, meaning the larvae in the corpses of some of the unburned infected washed downstream, spreading the infection. That is why the oil field went back online, so that the oil leak prevents the spread of the infection, but you go back to turn it off and prevent the leak. In one of the tapes, Ocelot kind of points this out to Kaz to make him feel guilty. The other testing grounds was Afghanistan, hence the scorched earth operation I was referring to at the beginning. It wasn't just an act of revenge, it was to clean up and eradicate the parasite after testing. The next question Ocelot and Kaz ask is, what the fuck happened at the Devil's House? Code Talker explains that patients would be infected with the parasites, an incision would be made in their throats, and an audio device playing different languages would be put in. The aim for this was to program the parasite to learn specific languages, making new language strains. They were banking on mutant strains that can pick up or react to specific languages, kind of like selective breeding, slowly culturing a strain that gets specific to a language. Ocelot notes that this method would take ages to get the desired results, but Code Talker explains that it is not only when mating that the parasites listen to language. Larvae nearing hatching would show markedly increased activity in reaction to a specific language. It would be those unhatched larvae that would be placed in the throat of new subjects, enabling quicker results and an easy way to narrow down the larvae. Now that we mentioned the vocal cord parasites, it is worth mentioning the importance of other parasites in the story, because they explain some of the abilities of other characters in other installments. Parasites are integral to the story, as it explains why some of the characters you see in other installments have the abilities they have. Ocelot observes that, like Quiet, Code Talker has not eaten anything for days on end. Code Talker confirms that his body is covered in parasites, which is why he has managed to live on over a century. He was approached by a foundation 20 years ago that told him that they found an unusual parasite or sample for him to see. Seeing how his research on the parasite hit a dead end, he enthusiastically went with them. He is shown the remains of a dead man who died in an explosion. He mentions his flesh had not decomposed and the tissues themselves were still metabolizing. The parasites were keeping the tissues alive. That is when an obsession sparked with parasites, in which Code Talker would be so far involved and obsessed with, he implanted the parasites in himself from the dead man's flesh, which explains how he is still alive and able to see despite not having properly functioning eyes. In some other words, he infected himself with the parasites that the End had. He also highlights other strains that grant different powers, one supplying its host with adrenaline in response to pain, another that could control insects at will, but they denied allowing him to use it for himself, but the Cobra unit denied allowing him to use those other strains for himself. And that is how some of the Cobra unit members had their unique powers. It is here that we can now piece together why Quiet is the way she is, as she has one of those parasites mentioned above, but we will explain her fully later. Code Talker also sheds more light about the skulls. The skulls also have the parasites similar to the one Quiet has, and by similar they are also parasites that live on the body, similar to the strain that Code Talker and Quiet has. Code Talker explains how he modified the parasites that he isolated from the End's corpse back in MGS3. Code Talker mentions some of the different abilities you can get from infecting yourself with the parasites that live on the surface. He says that one can go invisible, much like Quiet. Quiet can go invisible. He also notes that the others harbor different species of MA, which can oxidize and reduce metal. He talks more about the skulls, particularly about their weakness. He says that the skulls, much like Quiet and Code Talker, have parasites that live on the outside. And because they live on the outside, their weakness is desiccation. Hence why the skulls release salt around them, condensing the water vapor. Once supplies of water run out or skin moisture goes, the skulls are in danger and stay in suspended animation. Rain or large amounts of water can also trigger this suspended animation state. So that is why you have that misty looking... So that's why it gets misty when they're around. It's so that they condense the water vapor by emitting salt. So at this point, just remember that there are different kinds of parasites granting different kinds of abilities, and that the ones Quiet, Code Talker, and the skulls have are called the parasites that cover. It's their nickname. Just stick with that for now. Carrying on, 48 hours after administering the Wolbachia vaccination, the vocal cord parasite threat comes to an end for now. However, the symptomatic staff were too late, and they still proceeded to die, as it was too late for them. The story then pans back to Emmerich and Ocelot in the torture room. After learning more about metallic archaea, Ocelot returns with a new approach to interrogating, having in his possession a syringe with metallic archaea in it, which would eat right through his leg implants that are attached directly onto his femur. Emmerich reveals the information Ocelot is after, that being the location of Sahelanthropus. This information is requested as the last step in Skullface's plan is to activate Sahelanthropus, providing Diamond Dogs a final opportunity to stop him. After infiltrating or killing your way through OKB-0, Big Boss catches up to Skullface. The two end up making their way to Sahelanthropus together in an XOF convoy, where Skullface reveals more about his intentions. The two do not engage each other here as Big Boss is outnumbered, and it is far too early for Skullface to get into combat, as he is not near Sahelanthropus. He doesn't want to risk a full-out war before he's able to bring his plans into fruition. The ride to Sahelanthropus doesn't really explain much about Skullface's main objectives. In actual fact, many people commented that the scene was quite cheesy for the mere fact that a good third of the ride is just you staring at each other while there's music playing in the background that really doesn't fit the scene. So what I'll do is we'll just give a little bit of a snapshot of Skullface and Big Boss and the little story behind it before talking mainly about what Skullface was trying to achieve, what his objectives were. So let's quickly talk about the snapshot behind Skullface. Let's give you a quick snapshot behind Skullface first before moving on. Right. Okay, so it's important to note that the English strain is the one strain that Cypher, or Major Zero's Cypher, could not allow, as it would thwart Zero's plan to unify the world in accordance with his interpretation of the will of the boss, to unite the world, that is, in summary. So Skullface wanted to exact revenge on the people that would subjugate people, those corrupting people's identity by forcing another language on them, using the power of language to control information, i.e. much like what Zero was doing with his information network. English is to be seen as a convenient code for Major Zero, and by eradicating it, he would stop the world being eaten by English. Skullface knew that English was a convenient code for Major Zero, and by eradicating it, Skullface thought that he would stop the world being eaten by English, thinking he would save language, culture, and race from annihilation. And if anything, I partly understand what he means by that. Have you ever heard the term lost in translation? Whereas you can say the same word in a different tongue, yet at the same time it will convey a different picture or a meaning. And, it's not just language. That's an oversimplification to think as just, words. You could just speak another language and say the same thing. Not necessarily. That's not necessarily what's being implied here. And then you see the problem with that scene is the tapes give you a bigger backstory than the actual scene. So, like I said, we're going to go through a bit more of that. Code Talker mentions the importance of language in the tape, and he says that the ruler's first purpose after conquering land is to force a new language. Then he uses examples like colonialism, where seeds of English has been planted in other countries and colonies, and you have English becoming the dominant Franco because of this. Similarly, he also draws upon America as an example, and it's basically saying he goes on to explain that to exploit the goal of wealth, you must speak English. So it's kind of like the playing field, it's like the field that you must play. That's in a way how English is taking over. Interestingly, to illustrate the importance of language, basically he uses an analogy to explain the way America is at the moment, where you have many people, many different types of groups of people that never mix, and you have hundreds of different ethnic backgrounds sticking to their little colonies and not mingling with other groups. And he's saying that basically English allows us to make symbiotic relationships with each other. You have unacquainted neighbors and brings them together. So long story short, to recap that bit, because that was all over the place, Code Talker and Skullface is aware how English is used to unify the world, because it's able to bring people together despite their differences. Nevertheless, Skullface wants to exact revenge on the people that would subjugate people to speak another language, by controlling them to speak another language, because In Skullface's eyes, you lose more than just language. You lose everything. You lose identity, culture, etc. As you get to Sahelanthropus, Volgan appears again in an attempt to ambush you. He also surprisingly spawns with the floating boy. The floating boy seems interested in the passing Diamond Dog's chopper and instead starts floating towards it. As he is doing this, the man on fire starts walking away from Big Boss towards the track and gets crushed by Sahelanthropus. Skullface gets pulled out of the base, and as he is doing so, he yells out, "Who is doing this? Such a lust for revenge." This is hinting away at the floating boy's powers, and he is wondering who's using the boy as a conduit this time, as he is not in control. He's being overridden, and so it's not meaningless once again. It directly relates to his abilities, but more on that later. Sahelanthropus, whom is being controlled by someone else, breaks free. While destroying the surrounding area, some of the debris falls off and crushes Skullface's lower half, wounding him badly. Sahelanthropus then proceeds to attempt to kill Big Boss. After destroying Sahelanthropus, you go back to where Skullface is lying. So you pick up the vials that he had in his possession, and you notice that there's only 2. The 2 vials that you find on Skullface is tossed into a nearby oil fire. However, you do not manage to get the 3rd vial, as that is with the 3rd boy who you see float away with it. When Big Boss asks Skullface where the 3rd vial is, he said, "It's very close to you." And I guess we literally meant that, because the floating boy was like right behind him. So concerns are raised about the whereabouts of the 3rd mating pan, as it exposes the personnel on Mother Base to another threat and another outbreak. Kotoko tries to get Big Boss to think who might have or be in possession of the 3rd vial, as it is a big threat, not just the Diamond Dogs, but the whole world. Kaz and Big Boss then shoots off Skullface's limbs and lets him bleed to death. However, Emmerich gets out to kill him in an attempt to prove his innocence and loyalty to Diamond Dogs, but instead it looks like an act of cowardice. Now would be an appropriate time to talk about Skullface's objectives. The tapes go on to explain that the ethnic cleansers that Skullface wanted to use was not something he pioneered or discovered or thought about using initially. It was originally picked up by Cypher, and by Cypher I mean when Major Zero was at the head of it. The tapes then go on to introduce testing that was done in relation to the ethnic cleanses in Afghanistan and Africa. Africa and Afghanistan would be the testing grounds. Its purpose would be ethnic cleansing of people that speak a particular language. The idea behind it would be that it would be a weapon of mass destruction used to eradicate groups, races, and colonies by the language they speak, or a tool to build a misguided utopia. The project, however, was left alone after some time. But after Skullface was exiled to Africa with a task force of his own, he saw the opportunity to continue the research while following his own agenda. He also does it without telling Zero from Cypher, as a weapon that eradicates English would be of no good to Cypher or Zero's vision of the future. So, after Zero exiles Skullface with a task force in Africa, he sees that thread dangling pretty much, so he decides to pick up the research, because the research was abandoned after Cypher was fiddling around with it initially. Major Zero's Cypher, that is. Skullface wanted to launch Sahelanthropus for the world to see in Afghanistan, because he felt that this would trigger another nuclear arms race among the major nations. He also thought that it would create a demand for other non-major countries to arm themselves with nukes, which was the idea. Skullface would sell his fail-safe nukes to everyone. Sahelanthropus would be used as a marketing tool to sell it all around the world. Diamond Dogs stopped the plan before it happened, though, as you obviously destroy Sahelanthropus again before it is revealed to the world. Kotoko explains the importance of language to rulers. When people unite under one will, they become stronger than the sum of their parts, and the one will is the ruler's will. And what do rulers use to bring people together? Language. Ancient Rome, Napoleon, and English Empire. So this is probably why Skullface is trying to eradicate English, as this also stops Zero implementing his interpretation of the will of the boss. He just doesn't like the idea that people like Zero would, subjugate people and control people by basically overwriting their tongue. And this also draws upon the quote near the beginning of the game, where it says that it is no nation that we inhabit, but a language. However, if you want to find the main reason and backstory behind Skullface, you can find it in the tape called Skullface's Objectives, Tape 5. Skullface was born in Hungary. While he was young, the country partnered with Germany during the Second World War. However, they came under Soviet occupation, which came down hard on his country. His country would be ruled by a foreign tongue countless times, resulting in him losing his not only his mother tongue, his country, family, culture, and identity, which would be constantly overwritten. He was really good at covert and stealthy combat, boasting an impressive record on the battlefield, causing several deaths of the Soviet occupation in a plethora of ways. He defected to the West and joined the SAS. After meeting Zero, Zero decided to make Skullface his XO, leading a unit that no one else would know about called XOF. XOF was made at the same time Fox was made, during the Virtuous mission, or just before the Virtuous mission would be brought into effect. The group would be a support one, aiding, ensuring, and cleaning up after Fox, for any missions that they would be deployed on. The tape goes on to reveal that Skullface wanted to exact revenge on those that would use language to subjugate people, as we already said before, in particular those corrupting people's identity by imposing a different tongue on them. Hence his focus on Zero, who Kotoko says would love to see the world Englishized as part of his ideology. But not just his ideology, it's you got to remember, it's what he thinks the will of the boss was. And we already know that English would be a convenient and instrumental code for Zero's plan in implementing his interpretation of the will of the boss. So Skullface was genuinely of the belief that if he eradicates English, he will stop the world being eaten away. If he failed, he would gladly see the world nuke itself, preventing the loss of identity, language, and culture. Another thing I would like to note about the scene taking place before you fight Sahelanthropus for the second time is that you see a cutscene in which the camera pans in close to Liquid's face. As it moves to the side, you see the floating boy in the background. The scene does not explain much, but the tapes do. What we see in that scene also relates to what Skullface was yelling out. So I guess now would be a good time to explain the story behind the floating boy. So fast forward and moving on to the informant's report. You get a mission to collect a canister filled with intel from an undercover spy of Diamond Dogs who gets killed. The intel was on the boy and the man on fire. The intel reveals all there is to know about the floating boy and his abilities. It also explains the interdependency between Man on Fire and the boy. So the first question worth asking is, well, who is the floating boy and Man on Fire? Both the boy and Man on Fire were test subjects for paranormal research for military purposes. The boy was nicknamed the Third Boy. En route to Moscow, his cognitive abilities awoke. The boy is easily influenced by other people's biofields, particularly evil thoughts like feelings of revenge, malice, anger, or resentment. During the flight to Moscow, the powerful mental field of Big Boss awoke in his abilities. He is somewhat of a conduit between people that have really strong evil desires or anger in them. The boy is able to pick up emotions, amplify and unleash in his body as they recur in his brain. In addition, while he is parasitizing a host, his ego shuts down, allowing the host to take control of his telekinetic powers. The tape hints that someone has been manifesting his power with the strong and extreme desires for revenge. Sahelanthropus and Man on Fire has been made alive by the boy. The boy parasitized the Man on Fire's desire for revenge, giving him abilities in return. At times, it would also be Skullface that would take control of the boy's powers. You see this when you get captured by the large hand back into Smar Salaman. That was Skullface's vengeful mind at play. Hell, even at the Devil's House, that is another instance in where Skullface was controlling Man on Fire. So what happened at the facility where you see Sahelanthropus for the second time? Well, someone must have had a stronger desire for revenge, as can be seen when Skullface loses control. That is what he meant by, yelling out who had such a strong lust for revenge. So who could it be at that time? Well, it is Eli. Emotions transmitted in children are more receptible than that of adults. The cassette tape says that, in fact. It must be Eli, which also explains the cutscene in the helicopter as it was flying over the facility. The data found in the informant's report also suggests that in Eli's case, Eli and the Third Boy are acting in symbiosis, like acting together pretty much, as one. The informant report also goes on to explain the story behind the plane crash, which you hear the news reporting of during the prologue chapter. Listen out for it next time, it's pretty interesting. So the informant's report goes on to explain that the plane's position was directly north above the hospital where Big Boss was asleep for 9 years. That was when the first anomaly happened in the plane's path to Moscow. The plane was enveloped in flame and the fuselage burnt out as soon as synchronicity formed between the boy and the Big Boss. The Third Boy was then secretly moved to the research facility that Man on Fire was in. Volgan became the Man on Fire and the boy starts puppeteering him the moment they basically meet up in the base. Man on Fire tracked Big Boss down using his instincts, adamant on exacting revenge on Big Boss for what happened to him in Metal Gear Solid 3. Skullface, having monitored the two subjects, discovers the hospital and sends Quiet and XOF. Ocelot explains that the third boy, or Psychomantis, had a life reduced to slavery under other people's will. Only emotions he could feel was a desire for revenge. So the next question worthwhile asking, is who is the third boy? The third boy is Psychomantis as a kid. After destroying Sahelanthropus and exacting your revenge on Skullface, you return to Mother Base with the destroyed Sahelanthropus. As the chapter comes to a close, Eli sees Psychomantis hovering above Sahelanthropus. It appears that his biofield is now in synchronicity with Psychomantis's. Psychomantis also hands over the third English-trained parasite mating vial. It appears that they are plotting something bad, but the scene comes to a close. Enter Chapter 2. Quiet is detained and tortured as the staff find out she's infected with the vocal cord parasites as well. When we look back at this scene, you realize how tragic it is because Quiet cannot explain herself in English at all, as she is infected with the English-trained vocal cord parasites. Unbeknown to the Diamond Dog staff members, she gets tortured, but unsurprisingly remains quiet, as her name suggests. They are trying to figure out what her motives are. After the torturing goes nowhere, Ocelot decides to stop the torture, as it is quite clear that it does not appear to warrant hostility, as a hostile intention is obviously ruled out, because she's not done something, and she's been on the base for quite a while. He also suspects that she has feelings for Big Boss, seeing it as another reason to not doubt her. Miller, as always, is suspicious and hellbent on killing her, as he is blinded by his desire for revenge and feelings of anger. And he wants to eliminate any risks, especially after the first outbreak. Big Boss orders to have her remain alive, noting that she cannot speak and therefore cannot spread the infection, thus overruling Kaz's wishes to have her killed. She subsequently gets freed again, and the torturers leave the room. Code Talker comes to her side and speaks to her in Navajo. She surprisingly speaks back to Code Talker in Navajo. She reveals that Skullface used her as a vector to transmit the English strain on board Mother Base, but that she has refrained from speaking English, thus preventing copulation and the progression of the parasite. The next person that would be interrogated is Eli. He is being asked questions about the 6 children you rescued earlier, escaping again after Ralph's death. And if you don't know who Ralph is, Ralph was one of the 6 children that you rescued from earlier on in the campaign. Ralph was the one that gets crushed by a pipe, if you remember. You should remember this, by the way, because it's quite bad if you don't. And the reason that they're interrogating Eli is because Kaz suspects Eli was the reason behind it. So as you rescue each of the 6 children again, you get more tapes updating you on the situation or progress with the interrogation of Eli. Eli confesses that the children went back out of their own volition and that we should not return them. After you rescue escaped child 4, you get more information in a tape that the children made handmade weapons and explosives hidden in their quarters, which were confiscated of them. At this point in time, Eli is threatening Diamond Dogs, saying that if the last of the escaped children return, there will be consequences or an uprising. Eli gets moved to solitary confinement as a countermeasure, and the children currently on base are barred from outside contact. Ocelot plans to interrogate Eli after the last kid is returned. After you return the 6th child, the game or the scene goes back to the interrogation room with Eli in it, and Eli subsequently gets broken out by Psychomantis, and he floats away with Psychomantis and the 5 children that you rescued earlier. It would have been 6, but if you remember, Ralph gets crushed by pipes. So, yeah. Ocelot is puzzled as to how this was possible, considering how they were in solitary confinement. He theorizes that it must have something to do with Eli telepathically reading the minds of his interrogators, but we can kind of piece together that it was probably through Psychomantis that he was able to coordinate and plot such a thing. The children's uprising was plotted to divert the attention of the staff on Mother Base for Eli's escape. Right, now it's worthwhile mentioning here that many people think the Eli story stops here, but it does not. The reason they think that is so is because Mission 51 can only be viewed as a cutscene if you have the Collector's Edition. If you do not have it, then don't panic. Someone has uploaded that cutscene for you to see on YouTube. Link is in the description. I'm not going to explain it here or show you it because I don't want to get in trouble by Konami, because that's a content that I didn't pay for, I don't have, and the link is, you should just watch the cutscene. The cutscene's quite cool, but it was cut out of the game for whatever reason. Further on in the story, Mother Base gets infected again. This time, the strain is doing far more damage than the first time and has spread all over the quarantine platform laboratory. It began after a radiation leak in the facility's research block was detected. A team was sent to seal off the leak and to move the researchers into the containment block, but that was when they noticed the outbreak. Another team was sent in to salvage the situation, but neither teams managed to get out. Big Boss decides to go into the facility on his own. He notices that most of the staff seem to be infected, and some are in a state of panic. The place is damaged and littered with corpses. At the door prior to entry, Code Talker says that those that are infected must be put out of their misery. On the first playthrough, a few of the characters reveal a desire to simply go outside in the open. This can be taken as ordinary until you proceed to the researchers at the top. Once you get to the researcher at the top, in his dying moments he blurts out, "I win, I am no snail." This will be explained in a moment. The new infection produces an overwhelming urge among the infected to get out in the open. By doing so, it enables the infection to spread beyond Mother Base as the birds feed on the infected flesh, spreading the infestation to the world. The birds are attracted by the scent that is given off. Just before you enter the quarantine platform, Big Boss notices it. The infected burst through the room and frantically aim to get out, nearly overpowering Big Boss. Few guards escape but are swiftly bombed to prevent the spread. The researchers you see on the top floor recorded his findings post-infection in a tape. He explains his increasing urge to go out in the open as a symptom of the parasite. The parasites are wanting the ravens to feed on them, hence the sweet secretion you detect prior to entering. He says that he modified a pair of NVGs to detect temperatures similar to the infected pharynx or fever levels, enabling you to see who is infected. In a rather bloated scene that lacked real emotion by Metal Gear Solid standards, you descend into the lower floors and kill your own staff members one by one using the modified NVGs to slay the infected. Once the scene ends, you walk back into the blood-filled hallway and go down on your knees and remain beside your slayed soldiers. Code Talker explains that the cause of the second infection must have been due to an exposure to a powerful mutagen. He notes that those that were infected previously still contained the parasites in them, but that they were just in a state that does not allow copulation, as the males turn into female. He also then goes on to explain the slug quote that the researcher was mentioning earlier. He goes on to talk about leucochloridium, which is a type of parasite that, once it parasitizes a snail, the snails will desire to be in the light, contrary to their dark and gloomy natural habitat. Not only that, the snail's antenna will also swell, and the snail will start wiggling it to resemble caterpillars, thus making them look tasty to birds. Similarly, you have parasitic hairworms infecting praying mantises, making them jump into water and drowning themselves. You have toxoplasmic gondii from rats, which can also affect humans. Oh, by the way, toxoplasmic gondii is quite nasty. It's basically rats. Once it parasitizes a rat, it makes them run into cats and get killed, pretty much. But the disgusting thing about it is it can transmit from cats to humans. We also get another tape in which Kaz thanks Code Talker for enabling him to get the much-needed evidence to punish Emmerich accordingly, as they can now pinpoint who was behind exposing the parasites to the powerful mutagen on the base. But before you deal with Huey, you go on to mourning your soldiers. I'm not going to explain much here other than the fact that you decide to turn the ashes into diamonds so you can put on your equipment. You should know what goes on here. It is quite straightforward. From this point onwards, you can actually see the diamond glisten on your arm when you're sitting in the ACC or going about in the open world. So going on to Huey, we learned that after persistently putting on a convincing performance as to his innocence, that Huey was actually a bad and spineless person, guilty of betraying diamond dogs and frequently lying about past events. We learned that he contributed to the mutation of the bioweapon that contaminated Mother Base for the second time. How? Well, beta rays were being emitted off the X-ray equipment that the research team would frequently use to monitor the infection. Someone added a beta ray emitter leaking out from inside the equipment. Someone must have added a beta ray emitter, as it was beta rays that were leaking out from inside the equipment. The emitter was retrofitted, making the shielding inadequate. The person that inspected and ordered the equipment was Emmerich. They were able to trace it to Emmerich, making him the person with the opportunity to install the emitter and none other. So, in other words, it was only him that could have done that and no other. Not only that, Kaz also managed to secure more evidence, proving that he reached out to a biotech company who has DARPA as a client. And DARPA, by the way, is a Cypher-affiliated organization. And with that new information, Huey has been accused of trying to offer the parasite in return for his safety to cover himself. The deceit, frequent lies, and untrustworthiness of Emmerich leads to him being exiled after a final hearing rather than executed. Ottocon's father is weak, pathetic, and an evil man that would do anything to get out of a risky situation, contrasted with his son, who is quite the opposite. During his time on the base, he does create a mini Shagohard / Metal Gear for you to use, but there is not much else to be said about that, really. As for Strangelove, we find out in the last recording that she sent Hal to safety in the States to avoid him being used as a test subject in the new Metal Gear. In retaliation, Emmerich forced her into the pod where she would suffocate, and I guess it's worthwhile listening to the final tape if you've not done so already. Emmerich is exiled on a boat with some food and supplies. We later learn he made it onto land and is still alive. Diamond Dogs will continue to keep an eye on him, but that is it as far as Emmerich is concerned. The next character I want to talk about is Paz. Some time ago into the game, you are called back to Mother Base about a situation. You surprisingly see Paz being treated in the medical bay, despite being led to believe she died back in Ground Zeroes. You see a flashback of the horrific bombs that were extracted out of her body and her selfless act of jumping out of the chopper. Kaz and Ocelot explains that she somehow managed to survive despite hitting the water hard from such a height. They go on to mention that the shock must have triggered some sort of amnesia, as Paz still thinks it is 1974. Nor does Paz have any memory of events past that time period of 1974. Ocelot explains that Paz must have some sort of dissociative disorder, which is convenient because it will also mean that she won't be able to tell you anything about Cypher and Zero. But if you do the Wandering Mother Base Soldiers side ops, you get photos of past events that you can go and hand in to Paz. Once you hand them all in, you get the last photo to show her, which is hanging outside her room. It is a photo of a blue butterfly. As you complete the questline and hand in each photo, you get a tape recording of her thoughts. Well, I'm going to just burst through them right now, but in tapes 1 to 4, we hear that preparations will be made over the next few days for a festival on Mother Base. But we won't go into too much detail here, as you should listen to the tapes, as they are voice acted really well. But fast forward to the final tape, where she notices that Peace Day never comes. It always is 3 days away, and that 3 days never gets shorter. And why? Well, Paz reveals that she is a figment of your imagination, and that she was not alive post-Ground Zeroes. Peace Day never came. She explains how she followed her orders from Cypher and was thrown into the ocean after failing at that mission, back in Peace Walker, if you don't remember. She goes on to explain how she was captured by Cypher whilst it was under Skullface's control rather than Zero's, but more on that later. She reminisces about how much fun she had during her time on Mother Base and how happy she was during her short stay. During the last tape, she explains that she will no longer be around. And after the flashback, when you visit her for the final time, you wake up on a balcony. If you try to return to her room to see her, you will notice that it's barricaded and it looks like it was never accessible from the beginning. This was a really good close to the character, and you should probably hear the tapes for dramatic effect. But the important question is, well, why did he hallucinate her? Well, if you remember the injuries he incurred from the beginning, the doctor explained that he may hallucinate, and so here is an instance in which he does. If you do not get the tapes, then you need to capture the Wandering Soldiers in the side ops menu. Complete them and complete this side story because it's quite cool. Moving on to Quiet. So after the second infection on Mother Base, Quiet inexplicably breaks out of Mother Base and disappears. When setting out and looking for her at her last known location, you acquire a prisoner transport log, which states that she is imprisoned and has been moved over to Lamate Palace in Afghanistan. Code Talker reveals that Quiet was carrying vocal cord parasites, particularly the English strain. Skullface used her as a vector if his assassination plan failed. Ocelot predicts that something changed as she obviously chose not to speak English while on Mother Base. He also notes that Quiet only spoke in Navo, so, he just rules out any attempts of her to actually carry out Skullface's plan. He goes on to mention that if the staff found out about her having the vocal cord parasite strain in her, that the staff will not tolerate her or risk her. This is also why she refused the Wolbachia treatment, instead choosing a vow of silence. But after the mutation of the parasites, it was clear that this may not be enough to prevent it spreading. Either way, Diamond Dog decides to go after her to prevent her from spreading the infection and to get her back if possible, as she poses a risk. You go to her location when she's imprisoned, and you witness a superbly choreographed combat scene, which you should probably check out. After breaking her out, you both get stuck into a very long and arguably tough battle with several armoured enemies and tanks. During the battle, you are both knocked out. You wake up in the middle of a sandstorm, which enables the remaining personnel to move past without detecting you. After getting bit by a rattlesnake and falling into critical condition, the chopper is desperately trying to find you among the storm. Quiet is the only one that is awake and able to use Snake's radio to guide the chopper. The only problem is that the pilot knows English, not Navajo. After much hesitation, she decides to speak English, guides the chopper to Snake, and leaves, effectively sacrificing herself. Once you regain consciousness, you go after her last known location to find a tape that explains everything about her backstory. She confirms that she initially set out to exact revenge on you. She wanted to express her feelings for you but couldn't, thus implying that she fell in love with the Big Boss, or Phantom Big Boss. She also reflects on how much of a shame it was that there was no common tongue between you two. She notes that from the beginning, vengeance is what brought her to them, and by them she's referring to XOF. She says she cast aside the language of vengeance, which is what XOF was speaking and would have her speak, and instead chose a language of gratitude, going back to silence. She walks back into the sandstorm and effectively shuts herself off from everyone. Now, I've noticed a little loop here because a lot of people saying she went off to die in the desert. I'm of the theory that she probably lived the rest of her life on her own, primarily because she doesn't breathe through her lungs. So if the parasites were to copulate and then go into her lungs and feed on it, well, she doesn't breathe through that. We already know that from the story. So chances are she's probably just out in the wilderness, still alive and living the rest of her days on her own. Or she probably purposely just dehydrates herself because the skin needs moisture. Because her parasites, well, apart from the vocal cord parasites, the parasites she has live on the surface. And if you remember, it's similar to the skulls unit, so they need constant moisture. So yeah. So whether or not she sacrifices herself, there's a bit of a loop here. Moving on to the ending, we are finally there. You get to replay the prologue, but this time with a plot twist and an ending. About the plane was directly related to the third boy, the plane that he was in crashing. But anyways, moving on, the scene begins in the room where everyone is being revived. Once Kaz and Big Boss have been stabilized, we see the staff turn to a third person, hinting that there were 3 people that made it from the chopper crash back in Ground Zeroes. The medic mentions that the third person has taken some shrapnel. So it turns out that this was not just a camera angle from the pre-release trailers, but an actual first-person perspective from the view of the third person who made it from the crash. You replay 3/4 of the prologue again, but with added details. For example, you see the rest of the photo showing you, the medic, with Big Boss and Kaz. You flip the photo over to see it signed by the real Big Boss saying good luck with your name on it. At the end, when you crash off-road and both of you are unconscious, the real Big Boss is taken out of the crashed van and is given your actual identity and papers. You can see your own name and date of birth on there. And I remember from the beginning we mentioned that there is a character creation screen with the name and date of birth. It's primarily for this and the Easter egg. So basically, the real Big Boss will assume and take over your identity whilst you take over his. But we'll explain how in a bit. I'm just explaining the core bit for now. Ocelot then comes to pick you up, and then that is where the rest of the prologue pans out as normal, as in the way you experienced it the very, very first time. So after the prologue, you go on to the next scene where you see Phantom Big Boss walking over to a mirror. He pulls out a tape titled The Man Who Sold the World, which is a David Bowie reference to one of his songs, which was about the schizophrenic episodes he went through when playing multiple characters at once. Phantom Big Boss inserts it into the device and plays the cassette tape. When the camera pans back to the mirror, you see the plot twist unfold unequivocally. You see the character you made in the beginning confirming that you were the medic all along playing as Big Boss. In the flashback of the chopper going down in Ground Zeroes, you see that the medic jumped in front of the real Big Boss, taking the shrapnel that was heading towards Big Boss himself. The recording, once it is played, is of the real Big Boss. We will analyze and break it down in a subsequent video, but here we need to note a time-lapse that happens subtly right in front of you. After the recording, you take out the tape and flip it to the other side. It is here that a time-lapse happens, as the label of the tape is Operation Intrude, which is the same mission name Solid Snake would be sent out to in the very first Metal Gear. You also see the logo on the front door change from Diamond Dogs to Outer Heaven after the time-lapse. Eventually, towards the end, Big Boss walks back into the fog / the present. Now that ending explanation may sound simplistic, but the truth tapes add more to that. In the tape called Doublethink, we get confirmation that it was actually the medic in the chopper and that he will act as the new Big Boss until it is time for the real Big Boss's resurgence, which will happen in MG2, not Metal Gear Solid 2, MG2. The idea here is to give the Phantom Big Boss an altered state of consciousness to act and think like Big Boss himself. How will Ocelot keep up with the lie? Well, he said that he'll have no conscious knowledge of the real Big Boss himself as well. He will conduct self-hypnosis to manipulate past events and his own memories, but he later explains a safety measure that will enable him to identify the real Big Boss when the time is right. So he has a failsafe to get rid of the self-hypnosis. You also get more information about L'Enfants Terribles. We find out that the project was dismantled in 1976, and ATGC took it down, and the account with DARPA was closed. In other words, the research came to a close. Therefore, Ocelot tried to get information on Big Boss's clones, because, I mean, they did go ahead and get the clones, but they subsequently closed down the project. And you happen to find that David, i.e. Solid Snake, never left the States. He was still in the States. Eli was in England, who would then later travel to Africa. Obviously, that's where you see him. And he would escape Zero's care in Africa. There is a problem, a bit of a, well, what many people think is a bit of a loop. There, in one of the tapes earlier on in the game, there's a mention of the DNA. And the reason that does not match is because you play as the Phantom Big Boss, and the Phantom Big Boss is genetically not Big Boss, because it's not the real Big Boss, so the DNA won't match up. But if it was the actual real Big Boss, then of course it would have matched. But Eli is very much liquid, and he's the L'Enfant Terribles' other twin, the recessive clone. In one of the other tapes for the Truth ending, we also get more information about the war economy in the Truth tapes. You start to we hear a cautionary tale that war is starting to become a business for manipulating the public mind, and that is turning into a new business model. We also hear that the Patriots are starting to be drawn to this business model, and they are scheming something on it. But obviously, we as the gamer and the audience know that that will eventually become the war economy and the SOP Patriots AI system. We start to see hallmarks of that coming into fruition, particularly Cypher's information control. Sigyn's information network is getting bigger and bigger, and it is slowly getting the ability to control information transmission, and thus be able to selectively choose what information passes and what doesn't. This bit relates directly to the plot in Metal Gear Solid 2. If you remember the S3 project that was run by the Patriots AI, the idea is that if you control what information gets out to people, you also can influence the decisions they make. And the idea behind this is to basically take control over people's decision making by controlling what information gets out to them, which is a very clever system. And not only that, is the Patriot AI in Metal Gear Solid 2 assumed responsibility that, you know, to get society on the same page and progressing, you need to filter and control the information there. But then again, I personally disagree with that, but that's a set topic for another video. Anyways, enough of that. That's going into another video, but all you need to know is that the information control side of things, you see it starting here. This is the genesis. We're starting to see the war economy in MGS4 blossom, the information control blossom, which was the problem in MGS2. And Ocelot makes a point about this, and I think Hideo wanted to add another point about all this AI control slowly assuming control over everything. The will of the Patriots carrying on as AI form, calling the shots rather than humans themselves, is that the human will is to be nurtured and handed down by human hands. And that's the point Ocelot is making. It's like very fine that you're trying to impose your will or the will of someone else, but at the end of the day, it has to be done, nurtured and handed down by humans rather than AI. And I guess that's a perfect point, because if you remember, they actually pass on the will to the Patriots AI, and then in MGS4 you have something disastrous. You have a dependence on the war economy. It shows how an attempt to unite people under one will can go so wrong, because that's what they did. But moving on, in the Truth tapes, Ocelot informs you that Zero has been attacked, reported that it was via bioweapon used to attack him. He had his stomach pumped and underwent dialysis, but he's still damaged and his health is deteriorating since then. His location is still a mystery. There's no trail or leads. However, we do know that Skullface was able to put together the assassination attempt. In the tape called Zero Attacked number 2, we find out that Anderson, who's also known as Sigyn, has taken over command of Cypher, or the AI he oversees. This is an AI that filters a massive amount of data before it is collected and passed on to people. We also know that Dr. Strangelove would help create the AI, but that she was forced away after Skullface's uprising, which explains the collaboration on Sahelanthropus after, helping create that AI, Patriots AI system. The Metal Gear Solid 2 plot is starting to be connected here. This is quite obvious. The AI will be called the Patriots eventually, which explains why most of the members were dead. If you remember Metal Gear Solid 2, post-credits, they're like, oh, most of the High Council's dead. And then Solid Snake's like, what the fuck? And it's because their will is continued in AI form. Lastly, Ocelot explains that the idea behind the Patriots back then is to make a united world and to make conceptual unity among everyone, whilst at the same time having some sort of their individuality intact. So it's about making the world one, as Zero is saying. But Ocelot then goes on to mention that Zero's will is starting to be a shadow of what it was now that it is planned to live on in AI form. I go on to quote him. He says, "The body dies, then so does its will." The next truth tape is Paz and Zero. Here we learn that Zero is in hiding and has a meeting with Paz. It is assumed that this is obviously before Peace Walker, because they're discussing about the events as if, it's not happened yet. Anyways, the tape is basically a recording of their conversation where he assigns her the mission that we see her doing in Peace Walker, which is to hijack Zeki and try and coerce MSF over to Cypher. You should probably listen to the tape, it's really cool. The next truth tape is between Paz and Skullface. And I guess it takes place just before Ground Zeroes, just before you get deployed to go rescue Chico and Paz in Ground Zeroes. In this tape, we know that it is impossible to try and locate Zero, but that it may be possible with Paz, which is why Skullface interrogates her. And Skullface does know that Paz met with Major Zero face-to-face in the facility that he was hiding in. She goes on to reveal Zero's location to Skullface, and mentions that he's in Hell's Kitchen and that how he's hidden and that the surrounding guards don't know who they're actually securing, etc., etc. After telling Skullface the location, the recording cuts out. One of the most interesting truth tapes is a conversation between Ocelot and Zero. And the both of them have a conversation. We finally find out who was the culprit behind the events in Ground Zeroes. Zero mentions that it was not him that attacked Mother Base in Ground Zeroes, and that was Skullface. The next interesting truth tape is a conversation between Ocelot and Zero. Zero explains that Mother Base was not his doing, and that was Skullface's decision. He also goes on to mention that he made a disinformation campaign to hide the fact that Snake survived the events from Ground Zeroes. We also find out that it was actually Zero that arranged to have Big Boss sent to Tequila. So, from the beginning, we weren't actually hiding from Zero. Zero was hiding you from Skullface. Which is why I said at the beginning, don't just accept for now that they genuinely were trying to hide from Zero, or they thought they were trying to hide from Zero. Eva would also assist and take charge of the operation to have him, sent over and hidden in Tequila. We can tell Ocelot and Zero have a grudge from the tone of the conversation that they're having, but they band together because of Big Boss. Both plan on how to keep Big Boss safe and come to some sort of agreement on that. Zero thinks no one will find him and that he will suppress information that might reveal his whereabouts in the meantime whilst they're in a coma. Zero goes on to mention that this will be the last time that the two meet, because obviously his health is probably going to get to him before they get to meet again. Ocelot agrees to help out in protecting Big Boss. It is here that Zero reveals the plot twist he was the mastermind behind, the Phantom Big Boss. This was Zero's idea. The idea of making a copy of Big Boss as a ruse and attempt to protect and throw off the enemy. He fills Ocelot in on this, and obviously he takes place because he conducts the hypnagogia and etc. etc. There's another truth tape recording of a conversation between Miller and Zero. It is here where Zero reveals his relocation plan of Big Boss to Miller. And however, he doesn't tell Miller the actual location, the British sovereign base of Tequila, but does reveal that someone familiar to him will be watching over him. And I guess he's referring to Ocelot here. It is important to note that Zero does not tell Kaz of the Phantom Big Boss plan or plot twist. It is Ocelot that tells him, which he indeed does after the ending. Kaz proceeds to ask Zero how he could have done that to Big Boss, particularly when Big Boss did so much for Zero and his country. However, Zero explains that it wasn't really his call to have Mother Base ambushed like that, and that his plan was to get Big Boss to come over to Cypher, as he needed Big Boss to implement his vision or interpretation of the original boss's will. The next truth tape is a conversation between Skullface and Zero. Skullface rings to discuss the gift that he has sent to Zero. As Zero is inspecting it, he describes it as a winged dagger of a comrade lost to the sands in Egypt, who served under the boss back in Rayforce. Zero goes on to say how he gave the pin to her and that she held on to it. But moving on. Skullface asks him to inspect the back in which Zero's finger is pricked. They go on to talk about the Cleanser Project, i.e. the parasites, the vocal cord parasites. And Zero interrupts Skullface and says that it was a predecessor's daydream. He said it was an excellent test case for reverse evolution, though, and there was nothing more than that, implying that Zero's Cypher wasn't really bothered too much about the vocal cord parasites, but that it was actually Skullface's Cypher that actually picked it up and moved along with it. Zero goes on to explain that it was quite a clumsy project in the beginning, and that he did not want the parasite project, but rather he wanted information control to create appropriate context for people's lives that prevents destructiveness of humans. He was saying that literacy must be suppressed if the world is to be united. He said the world becoming one, world the boss envisioned becoming a reality. That's what he wanted. Zero said it would be better to focus on weapons that would take out individuals rather than endlessly breeding parasites to clumsily take out races. Plus, Zero notes that after the Cold War, that enemies will be harder to detect as the information network gets bigger. Skullface retorts about people that do not want such a context attributed to themselves. Skullface draws upon his own losses and how he was robbed of his enemies. Skullface goes on to explain that a chain of retaliation is what will bring the world as one. However, Zero clocks on that the pin was poisoned. Zero collapses and Skullface says that he will continue the boss's work. The staff then burst in and rush into Zero's side, and the tape ends. The final true tape is actually quite sad, really, personally. It's of Zero visiting Big Boss, the original Snake, at his bedside in the hospital in Dekelia. The tape makes it clear that it has been 2 years, and neither the Phantom Big Boss or the real Big Boss has woken up. Zero starts speaking to the comatose Big Boss, or Jack. He explains that the other team he set up was XOF, and that the person who leaded that group did something to Zero, i.e. attack him with the bioweapon. Zero explains that his health will deteriorate from here on out, and that he will probably not remember Big Boss if he does not wake up soon. He also explains that he will never be able to forgive Skullface for what he did to Big Boss back in Ground Zeroes. Zero explains that by the time Big Boss wakes up, all that will be left of Zero's existence is a tombstone chiseled into the code of a machine, which will later be known as the Patriots AI, which is the AI system that you see in Metal Gear Solid 4 and which you destroy as Solid Snake in MGS4. And if you remember in MGS4, when you go into the Patriots AI, you see several tombstones that are chiseled into the code of the AI, and which is quite interesting actually. It looks like Zero knew what that would look like and what it would be. And finally, and tragically, he bids farewell, and the next time Big Boss and Skullface do indeed meet will be at the end of Metal Gear Solid 4, where Big Boss will pull out Zero's life support machine and kill him, even though he was probably cognitively dead well before then. So I thought that was a sad ending. We also we realized that Zero was not as bad as we were led to believe, and that he was actually not calling the shots when the original Mother Base was attacked. Finally, the final point worth mentioning is post-credits. Yes, in true Metal Gear Solid fashion, we have a post-credits section where a final exchange happens between Kaz and Ocelot, and I think this establishes the last link. Kaz is questioning what everything that they did previously was all for. And the reason he's getting really reflective right now is that he has eventually found out the truth behind Big Boss and his Phantom. Kaz feels betrayed. Ocelot explains that the real Big Boss is working separately to create a new nation, or outer heaven, so to speak, and that it will be above the current one that the Phantom Pain is working on. The one Big Boss will be working on will aim to be a military nation which would maintain world balance and be independent from struggles of supremacy, personal profit, and cycles of revenge. The plan is to support the Phantom Big Boss until the real Big Boss implements his plan. Phantom would carry on his legend and his meme. Ocelot notes that at some point, Big Boss's sons will become of age and come after him. By that, he's referring to Solid and Liquid Snake. After shedding more light on Big Boss's plans, Kaz decides to abandon Big Boss and make the Phantom and his son stronger so that they can be sent after him, as an act of retaliation. Ocelot notes that there can only be one Big Boss, hinting that Phantom will probably have to go at some point as well. Ocelot warns Kaz that if the day ever comes that he goes back to Cypher, Ocelot will aid the other son and he will treat Kaz as an enemy. And that's an interesting point, actually, because it made me think about the question of whether or not it was Ocelot who kills Kazuhiro Miller in Metal Gear Solid. If you remember back in Metal Gear Solid, we think Kazuhiro Miller to be alive, but we later find out that he was found dead in his home and that Liquid was playing as him all along. That's it, guys. There's a few more things that you may want to check yourself for fact-checking and seeing how Metal Gear Solid 5 links to everything else in terms of timeline and events. Just before post-credits, you get a summary of the timeline, which is a good way to fact-check your understanding of the events. Keep an eye out for 1995. That is when the first Outer Heaven uprising occurs, which was quashed by Solid Snake, in which the Phantom Big Boss dies. So that happens while the real Big Boss is in command of Foxhound. Then, in 1999, you can see Solid Snake kills the real Big Boss, but the Patriots revive him and keep his comatose body. And that wraps up the complete chronological story explanation, guys. That's Metal Gear Solid 5, and that is the guide complete. I've left out Revengeance because I don't think that's canon, despite the devs saying that it is canon. It didn't strike a chord, it wasn't consistent, and it lacked Metal Gear integrity. But anyways, so I just wanted to mention a few things at the end of this video. Thank you for the support and nice comments regarding the first part of this video. I'll aim to make more videos on Metal Gear Solid story, as there are a few plot holes, unanswered questions, critiques, and analysis I want to do. These two videos were meant as a guide to start out on, before we actually get down to the details. Thank you so much for watching, and God bless you all. And finally, for an in-depth discussion of some of the Metal Gear Solid installments, you should probably check out Super Bunny Hop. The guy is really good in critiquing, analyzing, and breaking down the Metal Gear Solid story in good detail. He's probably one of the best coverage on Metal Gear is Super Bunny Hop. And that's it, guys. I'll leave you there.